Welcome to the Digital Transformation Podcast, interviews with best-selling authors, innovative thought leaders, and top-shelf executives, all driving today's digital success. This is the show that will help you take advantage of digital transformation to build your business and career. I'm your host, Kevin Crane, and I'm so pleased that you're listening. I am so pleased to welcome Rich Hale to the program. Rich is the Chief Technology Officer at ActiveNav. ActiveNav is a data privacy and information governance software provider and innovator. They help enterprise organizations control sensitive data and support compliance demands and regulations, but also work to improve information governance and spur new ways of working that really make a difference. And Rich is with us today to talk about the ever-pressing challenge of information overload and what organizations can do to overcome the data crush and more effectively govern information in ways that not only ensure compliance, but also help improve organizational performance. So, Rich Hale, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being with us today. Organizations are overwhelmed with data, and users expect the amount of information that they must manage will only increase by as much as 5 times in the next couple of years. Have we outstripped our ability to keep up?
I think it depends. I mean, the answer is always it depends, isn't it? You know, I don't think, and you asked the question about users, can users keep up? I don't think we should expect users to have to keep up. I don't think it's fair. I think users have got a job to do. And so, you know, of course they need tools to be able to get at the information they need tomorrow and today, but to ask them to manage the data for the organization, to govern the data, I think is unfair, frankly. And I make that point because I see technologies saying to users, you must label this document, which of course is a reasonable request, but users often struggle to, and then something breaks and they've got to get out the door and they've got a meeting to go to and they're running out of time, and they're not going to do that, or they're going to try, but they're going to try and fail valiantly. So I think we need to provide users with the technology and means to do their day job and just operate fast. And in the meantime, the business responsibility is to provide the backstop for the users. You know, as users generate and innovate and produce data, it's for the business to ensure that they provide the safety nets for the user. So long as the user's not acting in bad faith, you know, not acting irresponsibly, provide the user's safety net so that the data they created can be collated, can be orchestrated, can be protected and reused again. I mean, I think the biggest sin that we make as users and enterprises is to create data and not reuse it. You know, and it's nice to see that that's changing, but you know, I think that's one of the worst sins. And you know, I think it's good that's in this sort of structured space. I talk about data governance in the structured space, for example, in applications. We're beginning to think about how we leverage those particular data streams for new value, and that's kind of the old big data world. I mean, big data is not going to go away; it's never will. But it's what used to be lazily called big data in my world. And we're doing a good job of kind of introducing new systems, beginning to get a grip of what they produce and how we understand what data they hold. But I'd contrast that with the unstructured user-generated content where users work every day. And I think we're still underwater and still struggling to come up for air there. We kind of let the genie out the bottle 20 years ago when we first connected 2 PCs together, and we've never got back to that. And so I think, you know, we need new ways of getting on top of that problem while, of course, enabling us to protect and leverage the big data sources that we've begun to curate and use more readily these days. So hopefully that sort of gets us moving.
Interesting, your comment about expecting users to perform information governance. I think there's 2 sorts of sides of the equation here. There are the folks that are using systems and information to perform their jobs, and then there are the folks that, perhaps like us, that are the system designers or the strategic folks. That is our responsibility to ensure the systems perform in ways that minimize that impact to our business users. You're almost saying plan to fail, in a sense.
Yeah, right? I think if you want users to truly innovate, and if you want users to be truly agile, you can't anticipate, nor should you try to anticipate all the different ways they're going to combine and use data. And trivially, you only have to look at your kids and the way they take a technology you've only just heard of and use it in a different way that you never thought of, you know, to see that happening in your own front room. And I think in the business it's exactly the same. I always talk about I love to use the example of information tagging. You know, there are technologies out there that ask users to sort of define the label this document. It's not unreasonable, but it's actually really hard. And so and as I say, the real world problem the user faces is that the drop down won't work, and the technology doesn't quite do it in the way the user understands. They haven't been well trained, and they just go, and they pick the first thing on the list and they go out to the next meeting, And so for me, I think the business has to recognize, to your point, we've got to find ways of best supporting them, but also recognize that that's quite a long journey. And we can't just sit back and say, yeah, the users have got it. We're good here, because that's irresponsible from an enterprise's perspective.
What is the impact of this disconnect between the needs of governance, the system design as a strategy, and the day-to-day work demands and flow of folks doing their job every day?
Yeah. Oh man, it's. I'm sad to say in a way, Kevin, it's not changed, has it really? And it's not to put too much of a sackcloth and ashes on things. I think we've come an enormous way in this overload. But long story short, users still struggle to find what they want in certain parts of their job. In other areas, I think they can find themselves well served when the business has done right by them, when they've identified a particular class of data, the way of surfacing it, providing access to it, curating it, and the like, making it available to the user. But otherwise, users still hunt and peck for the data that they need. I think more importantly, or maybe I should say, and we're beginning to see some really cool technologies that allow users to self-serve data from data lakes, combine data in new ways, although I'm still not sure that those are completely serving the user as well as they might. Regardless, though, I think particularly, and you'll recognize our specializations in this kind of wild west of data, the unstructured user-generated data, there's an enormous pile of toxic data, and that data, it's sort of hidden within that wild west. And we like to talk about dark data, and I know it's sort of a useful term that's been used quite a lot. It's only getting darker. The more data we add, the darker it gets. And so, there's a build-up of toxicity in that data. And I think we're seeing practically rising costs and litigation still. Hey, look, no one talks about storage costs these days, but cost of storage and cost of management still climbing. There's an increasing liability for toxic data. Breach these days is putting a real premium and a cost on that slowly. Privacy regulation is beginning to describe the risk. But I think, as I said earlier, we're a bit underwater for unstructured data, and we need some new technologies to enable organizations to not only dam the stream, but drain the swamp as well. Old terms, but it's still not been done generally in the unstructured data space.
Well, you bring up really important points about dark data. I still like talking about dark data or unnoticed data, and especially now when more and more information is found in places that are perhaps outside of information governance per se. It could be file shares, it could be personal drives, it could be something on the cloud, it could be something new, perhaps. One practitioner I spoke with recently was now tasked with archiving and managing 911 calls for police and camera footage from police body cams. These are critical pieces of information, data that are typically not associated with what we might call records management. And so how do we begin to get our hands around all of that when our old traditional notions of enterprise content management considered that we could put everything in one big place and manage it from there? But I don't think that's realistic anymore. What do you suggest for organizations struggling to get their hands around all this variety of data that they must manage today?
Yeah, you give some really nice use cases. The other one that springs to mind is I met a records manager in the UK who had been asked to work out how they identify records in Twitter feeds. And it was interesting to learn to the point about people using data in different ways. The council in the UK was using Twitter to talk with its customers, and then they suddenly realized they were creating a record. What do they do with that? It's a bit like your 911 call thing. And so I think for me, where the context is clear, like I would suggest your 911 call stream, there's a good context to that data. I think you can begin to treat that and handle that as a particular use case and get a really good ROI around it. I think you can describe why you need to deal with it. And I think the people doing that work need to recognize owning that stream. I'm thinking to your 911, the operations center, the leader of the operations center, recognize that there's value in that data and begin to work to understand what things they can do. I was talking in a defense conference a while back, and they were talking about what questions do they have to ask? What questions do they have? Can they answer it with that data? What might be hidden in that stream? And then they can create a business case and consider how they might extract that value from that stream. So when the context is clear, I think that's that those are the opportunities brought about by data mapping, by understanding the types of data and thinking about the data you're gathering in that context. I think when the context is unclear, such as you mentioned shared drives almost straight away, and kind of laptops, and we think about file sync and share and Slack and Teams. When the context is frankly random, it's kind of only bounded by the maximum extent of what the business does. I think the first step you've got to do is just understand what's out there. And I'd clearly contrast those two cases. One is the stream and the context is known, and the other one is the stream is essentially random. And clumsily we call them the unstructured and the structured world. I'm not sure they're quite good enough labels, but I'll stick with that for user generated content's not bad. Data in the wild is not bad. I think the contrast there is you've just got to begin to monitor and understand the nature of what's going on out there. Understand, you talked about designing systems. You can only design systems once you understand what the system's got to deal with and the patterns of activity that the systems need to support. And all the time that stuff remains dark. You're clueless. So I think I've got off your original question, but for me, the patterns are to recognize the two modalities, if you like, and not forget either. Clearly there's good ROI in the 911 call stream. That seems self-evident to me, but I think there's unacceptable risk and unsurfaced opportunity in the broader random data that's out in the wild in unstructured sources.
Do you want to be a guest on the Digital Transformation Podcast? Well, it could happen when you join our Knowledge Leadership Circle. Tell us about your ideas and advice. What technologies and solutions do you recommend? And how can our listeners benefit from your approach? Be a guest. Find out more at digitaltransformationpodcast.net/guest. We are speaking with Rich Hale. He is Chief Technology Officer at ActiveNav. ActiveNav is a data privacy and information governance innovator and service provider. We're talking about the ever-pressing challenge of information overload today and what organizations can do to overcome the data crush. Now, Rich, you mentioned the idea of getting more value out of information. Much of our focus when it comes to information governance, records management, content management is on sort of the risk aversion side, being in compliance, getting rid of risky data that we don't need, or packing away things that are so they are secure from cyber threats. But there's a great deal of cost and risk associated with all of this, but a great deal of opportunity as well. How can organizations really leverage their information in ways that make a real difference and build a new competitive advantage?
Yeah, I think, danger. I always find when I do these podcasts, I'm in danger of repeating myself, which is not your fault. It's the consistency of message for me, which is you've got to understand what's out there. I refer back to the defense conference I just did recently. You need to know the questions to be answered. So your people need to understand that data provides that opportunity and be smart enough to go, where can I find data that might help me solve the problem? Let's not guess. Can I move from experimentation to a real kind of real purposeful inquiry by understanding clearly the question I want to answer, and then how do I know where potential answers might be out there? And the root of that is in kind of understanding the data map of the business. On the one hand, the map of the applications you have, and so you need a mechanism to ensure that over time you understand the nature of the data being handled by each of the applications and processes. And we talked about 911 calls earlier. You need to know it's out there to be able to use it. Yeah. And so the people that own it need to be declaring it and need to do so responsibly. So I think the business needs not only the skills to build the data map and maintain it, the skills to understand that there's gold in their hills, and that they can go look and ask questions about what data can tell them, recognize who might have them, who might own that data, who might have a new insight or a new pattern that might be engaged with. And I think that inquiry can be driven by the data map by data maps. It's almost like a catalog, what's out there. And you mentioned risk a lot. I think they over time recognize that there are possibilities in the unstructured sources as well. And as I said earlier on, begin to get a sense of what's out there. So on the one hand, catalog and understand the questions that could be answered by your many business sources, and on the other hand, get a grip of that wild proliferating source, so that over time you can get on top of it and bring it to the party. Let's not just have a party over structured data land. Let's bring unstructured data to the party as well. And I think over time, that to me is how I see things have to go.
Well, I think that's a super powerful thing you're talking about. If I was a CTO and I didn't know what all information was in my organization and what risk or opportunity it represented, I'd be maybe a little embarrassed if I found out later that once I did that inventory, much of that was worthless information, redundant or obsolete or trivial, that wasn't providing me with any value, but certainly giving me lots of cost and risk. I'd be double embarrassed. But my problem is that I'm not certain how I go about doing that. If I don't know what I don't know, it's easy enough, I think, if I know I have a discrete system that I want to look at and do an inventory of that content or that information. But there may be other things that are happening within my organization that I'm not necessarily aware of, or being done maybe outside the purview of some of these controls. Is AI and machine learning the answer to getting this cohesive and comprehensive data map that you mentioned? How do we go about doing that?
Again, a direct question, Kevin. I feel like I can be on a collision course with my customers sometimes around AI and machine learning. I think the secret is to not get sort of dazzled by the hype out there. I think there's an enormous number of applications for artificial intelligence and machine learning, and they are different things. We shouldn't confuse the two. Clearly related. I contrast the two by saying that machine learning to learn is not alone, not in and of itself a panacea. Maybe the pace of advancements we've seen over the last few years has been stunning. The commoditization of those technologies has been quite something and awesome to behold. But nevertheless, ML alone, kind of let loose in the wild, ain't answering any questions for anyone. I mentioned context earlier. If you cannot provide that technology with context, it's really doing nothing for you. I think in particular applications, and I'm quite excited by your 911 example, actually. In your 911 example, I could see how machine learning can really be applied to that space, and you can see different ways of getting at that particular specialist content, different types of extractors, again, being commoditized by our cloud vendors these days, and begin to experiment and try stuff on that data. I think when context is unknown, that new application that's just been spun up, that pile of data you find in the notional corner that you've not found, or that pops up. And there's the other one that I spotted in my time where all of a sudden 10 gigabytes appears over there that you didn't expect overnight. What's in there? And ML doesn't do a very good job of that stuff at all. And so I think you need some very basic discovery instrumentation to complement it, to provide context. So if you can deploy technology that begins to orchestrate the context of the data, then I think you can fire ML bullets or seek the ML silver bullet to start solving some of those questions in context. That's when the two, I think, come together. So to answer your question, I think in times, who knows where ML will go? I think it's going to do, I'm not smart enough to answer that question, but I know it's going to be very cool. For today and for the next couple of years, don't rely on the ML silver bullet. You need some good old pragmatic context and heavy lift alongside ML to bring context to the ML question, in my opinion. I'd also say, people and machines got us into this problem. Only people and machines are going to get out of this problem. That's a quote from a lady called Deborah Logan of Gartner. And so you've got to bring users to the table as well to support ML, to support the technology. And I think some decision support tools and visualization to complement those two things and will enable us to sort of apply that technology successfully.
Now, Rich, I have not looked at the news today, but I'm betting that there was a hack today. And I fear that we're just starting to see maybe the start of a much more challenging environment in terms of cybersecurity. Even the biggest organizations are prey. In your view and from the Active Nav perspective, what are the biggest challenges today and what can we do about them?
I'll give you two views, the ActiveNav view and my view. Having kind of led at least part of our organization through our pandemic and this kind of massively changing mobile world, I've been most concerned about understanding user patterns, understanding where technology is letting users down, getting with users and understanding how we can help them understand the risks so they can operate freely and work with us to protect the business. I think our users don't want to let the business down and they want to know how they can help. But so there's a communication, training, and bringing new people up to speed with some of the risks, as they don't want to get caught out by this stuff. And that for me is the kind of the Rich Hale inside view of kind of how this is worrying us as an organization. I mean, from our offer to the market, I think necessarily organizations must focus on bolting the doors to prevent ingress and potentially to prevent egress as well, and also to spot bad actors when they're in the organization. But I think it's very clear that alone is not going to solve the problem. I don't wish to sound too cynical about it, but I think the breaches are inevitable. So the question for me is making sure that you understand what data's there, unsurprisingly, and getting rid of that, not leaving the honeypot where you can. And I think not only understanding what your data disposition so that you're providing appropriate protection where it's needed, but also in the event of a breach, you then got a much better chance of knowing what you lost. And then I think you can respect the people and the risk that comes from it, and deal with the liability that results, and also enable you to be much more transparent with your stakeholders about kind of what happened and what you're going to do about it. And so I come all the way back to, yes, get the doors bolted. You look really stupid if you don't do that, but understand what you got so that you're in a position to protect it and also respond when you do, if something bad happens. Those are my two sides to that coin.
You're listening to the Digital Transformation Podcast.
I am speaking with Rich Hale from ActiveNav. You can find out more and find Rich at activenav.com. Now, Rich, tell us more. How does ActiveNav help? Can you give us an example of one customer organization or perhaps a specific use case that you feel is a good example of success in meeting these challenges? And what did they do and what were the results?
Yeah, so one organization, I've got a small selection, some oil and gas customers who we find are very active in this space, who care about their data, insurance, finance, and a utilities company on the West Coast is going to illustrate some different use cases here. Each of them, as I said, care about their data, and so they've already been through the journey of recognizing that as good stewards of that data, they've got to do something about it. And so they have all deployed our technology that enables them to shine a light on that dark data. Most of them have been focusing on things like their file shares, their SharePoint environments, those wild spaces where they know they have an obligation, where they also know there's some value, and in these particular cases they're dealing with either a migration. So there's often an event that makes people change their behaviors here. So migration, often to O365, in response to a breach or a change of leadership. Something happens to make them so, no, we need to do something about our data. And so they use our data, our products to really quickly understand the extent, the nature, the size, the shape of the data they've got out there, the potential risk, but also and build a map of that data. And then most importantly, or more importantly, they then use our software to identify the data types and classes so that it can be appropriately labeled. And what I mean by that is, when you migrate to O365, take the chance to add some value to it as well. And so we're providing them context, we're providing labeling for that data so that when it's migrated into 365, that we can leverage all the other capabilities of that platform, that users can understand where to find it, and that users can identify how that data can be combined for their particular use cases. And of course, records compliance can be provided. What we also do then is we stay around. We keep on top of that data over time. We ensure that we show where data is changing, keep that map evergreen, and identify the user patterns and behaviors that record managers, governance professionals need to be on top of. In those cases, what our customers tend to get from the process is reduce migration costs. They don't migrate so much data because they get rid of the trash before they do it. They get compliant record regimes because they can now classify and apply record retention to their data. And then they can leverage the technology in SharePoint, in Office 365, in Teams, through the labeling, through the workflow that comes from it, and augment capabilities like Syntex and the Microsoft are bringing to the table. Use the Microsoft Information Protection Platform that we're providing information to, so that they can stay on top of the problem. So each of those organizations have done a great job of understanding their data and cleaning it up and getting it into good order so they don't have to go around the loop again.
Rich, it's been great speaking with you today. We're almost out of time, but before I let you go, one last question. What should other CTOs, executives, business owners be thinking about now and strategizing for in order to be prepared for the world in 5 years' time?
This is such a cool question. I thought for a while about where I possibly go, but I come back to how I even got into this game in the first place from my original Air Force origins. And we put a new label on it, and I'm really excited by it, actually. In 5 years' time, if we imagine all the things we talked about, Michael, the different classes of data, how people understand it and manage the risk and leverage it, how can they get to zero dark data? How can they ensure that their data is never dark, or at least if it starts off dark, is illuminated as quickly as possible? How can they put themselves in a place where their innovators and their operators can operate knowing that not only they're protected by the organization to operate freely, but they can get hold of that data because it's there in the catalog, and they understand what's available and how they can leverage it. So that only comes when you have zero dark data. And so I think that's achievable. I think it's notionally achievable. I think it's a big lift. 5 years is a great time frame. And I think you need to bring together technologies like ours, data governance, data lakes, and all those other things. They come together to illuminate data and achieve that aim. So that's where I'd like to think that we, at least in part, organizational leaders are thinking about for their data.
Very good. That is Rich Hale at ActiveNav. Find Rich and find out more at activenav.com. Rich, thanks so much for being our guest today on the Digital Transformation Podcast.
A pleasure, Kevin. Thank you very much for your questions. Enjoyed it.
That'll do it for this episode of the Digital Transformation Podcast. But join me next time when I continue to talk to best-selling authors, innovative thought leaders, and top-shelf executives, all driving today's digital success. And I'll talk to you next time on the Digital Transformation Podcast.